So let's have a look at Anthem for Doomed Youth. And the first thing that we should notice is that it is a sonnet. Okay, so Owen is really following these rigid conventions what we find in a sonnet. Okay, and in this sonnet he is expressing what is really indescribable, which is the senseless death that he witnessed firsthand on the battlefields in World War I. And so it's therefore appropriate to describe the poem's our interpretation of the poem with the, in light of this actual structure of being a sonnet. Now, in 16th century, sonnets were often, associated with unrequited love, and you might be familiar of Shakespeare's sonnets in I guess, a study in the middle school. But what is really Owen expressing in this sonnet? And it's really, you can say, unsettling. This is this form that is often associated with these deep romantic notions. But here, Owen is really challenging that. And in a sense, he's also, in some cases, challenging the sonnet form itself too. So pay attention to the lines that do not conform to these strict conventions. Sometimes he goes beyond using 10 syllables in a line. So why does he do that? So need to be aware of that. So in a sonnet, I guess you need to be aware of the actual structure. So we can see a sonnet has 14 lines, and it's divided into the octave or octet. I like to call it octave, 8 lines. And then here we have the sestet beneath it. So we have octave and a sestet. And you can see that in this case, Owen is following the outline of you can get the rhyming scheme, I would probably classify it as more of a Shakespearean sonnet. What I find interesting too in terms of this sonnet is Owen's use of a conceit. Okay, so a conceit, looking at the definition, is an elaborate and surprising comparison between two apparently dissimilar things. Okay, so what dissimilar things is Owen portraying, illustrating in this poem? And we see that with the really the brutality and futility of World War I in comparison to religion and religious services. Okay, so this is the comparison, and it is quite surprising and ironic that he is really looking at these two disparate images. Okay, and it's really what he's really saying, you can argue, is that in war there is no sense of, I guess, God or religion. So it's up to us to come up with that in terms of our interpretation. That's what I think. What do you think he's trying to do with this? So the first thing looking at in terms of the sonnet is his use of a conceit. And a conceit is a common feature within sonnet forms. And in terms of his discussing, I guess, dissimilar ideas, what is he trying to say? Is it the inability of religious rituals to address the real suffering that is going on in the trenches? So be aware also that a conceit is a type of metaphor. Okay, so it's a type of imagery. So in typical sonnets, to break between the first 8 lines, the octave or the octet, and the last 6 lines or the sestet, makes some sort of shift in the poem as well. And we call this the volta. And we do see that sort of shift in tone and imagery within the sestet. And we'll go into that shortly when we go into the poem in more detail. But you can kind of see how there is that shift between the battlefield in the octave and then the quieter, less action-packed world of the civilians at home. Okay, so moving on. So we've looked at the sonnet form, we've looked at the structure in terms of the octave and the sestet, and then we can see and identify the volta, which is a shift in between, I guess, the two stanzas. And we looked at the idea of the conceit, the two different ideas which Owen is expressing, and it's quite ironic. And you can now look at the actual title of the poem. This irony continues. And you can see the Anthem for Doomed Youth is deliberately ironic. And if you think about what is an anthem is usually a prolonged song of praise, such as something like a patriotic writer might have penned. We think about national anthems. But anthems can also have religious connotations as well. So an anthem could possibly be something part of a religious service or commemoration for the dead. So there's quite a lot of irony in the title as well. The actual brevity of the poem and how it's so concise could also emphasize the point that there is nothing to celebrate about in this subject matter as well. And if you look at the title, the sense of, Anthem for Doomed Youth, this doomed is so, I guess, foreboding. This use of doomed also instills a sense of overwhelming fate that cannot be reversed. And the fact that it's youth who is doomed to death also makes this title of the poem perverse as well. So Owen is not only overthrowing and challenging the conventions of a sonnet form by having the subject matter which doesn't really fit the conventions what we expect from a romantic poet, but this use of conceit, this disparaging imagery, the irony in the title. So he's really overthrowing the expectations. So you can also argue that in observing the literary traditions of the sonnet form, Owen is stylistically making it clear the disassociation of the subject matter. The brevity of the sonnet also suggests that there is little to be said about the subject matter as well. So let's now have a look at the actual lines of the poem. And we'll look at the first line in the octet. And it's asking this, I guess, question: what passing bells for these who die as cattle? So you can see that clear use of iambic pentameter, which is ta-da, 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 ta-da. But also, if you count how many syllables are in this line, does it really conform to this iambic pentameter? So iambic meaning there is 5 lots of feet, and the foot is in terms of I guess the stress and the unstressed, so ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. So what passing bells for these who die as cattle? And you can really see in terms of that simile, who die as cattle. What is it saying? It's sort of looking at in terms of this imagery, what is it trying to evoke? That really trench warfare does really dehumanize the soldiers. That they die in such numbers that it really strips them of their humanity. What is a passing bell? A passing bell is sort of an archaic term. It's a bell which is, it might be one long ring of the bells that is used to, I guess, mourn. You might hear it in a funeral service in, I guess, a parish church, something like that. So on the battlefields, who is actually mourning the soldiers who die? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle. So, in one hand, you have these soldiers who are dehumanized, who die as cattle, but why is it that you have the monstrous anger of the guns? Why are the guns personified? Okay, what sort of power do these guns have? And then that's metered again too with stuttering rifles, rapid rattle. Okay, so you've got that use of, onomatopoeia in conjunction with this alliteration that really makes this oral imagery of the war machine really stand out. So we've got this personification here that contributes to this harshness of this image, and not only is it visual, but it's also oral as well. We have these sort of sensual images that we, hear. But also these images are also in direct contrast to, religion. And in doing so, it really emphasises the destructiveness of war. So there's not even choirs that, mourn the death of the soldiers. All that they have is the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shires. Okay, so the repetition of that S sound, which we call sibilance, again adds to the whole effect of having, this poem sort of evoke that sort of imagery that there's nothing there to, mourn these soldiers. Or that there is that to actually mourn them on the battlefields is this, is that war machine. Also have a look at the use of consonants too. And consonants is a key feature of Owen's poetry. And consonants is a sort of real feature of Owen's work, where he's trying to experiment with his own voice. And one of the techniques that I think is quite specific to Owen is his use of this device. And he does it in the sort of the sense that it creates by having these vowels that don't rhyme perfectly, is again to have that evoke that sort of disturbing atmosphere. Okay, to again put us off in terms of, reiterating the impact that, war has, and how can he, describe the undescribable. And he's doing sort of, a really good attempt at, doing so in his craft. So we have the Volta and the shift in the sestet. And the sestet does open again with another rhetorical question that really marks his shift. What candles may be held to speed them all? So the speaker does not suggest that the soldiers will be utterly forgotten. Their liturgy will not be a formal religious rite, but more so how they will be remembered and worshipped will be in the pallid brows of their friends. So rather than the wreaths that you expect in a religious service, what they will have are the memories. So the sonnet again does conclude with an apt image of closure, not just of the closing of the poem, but we can see this drawing of the blinds at evening, at evening or in a house of mourning. So overall, we see in this poem the combination of both bitterness and poignancy, the direct and harsh criticism of the brutality of war, with the contemplation of those left behind in bereavement and grief. So as we conclude, just think about what is our interpretation of this poem. What is he trying to say? Okay, and how does the structure, how does the features, conventions illustrate that meaning? Have a look at the use of sonnet form. How is Owen challenging it? Look at the imagery, look at his use of conceit, the whole irony in having blowing away of the expectations of what you see in a sonnet and his subject matter. That there is nothing romantic about dying like cattle in the trenches. There's nothing that can, there's no religious service that can actually warn them. But what does remain, of course, are the memories. So as we go through, this poem, what does it mean to you? What are the values? What are the themes and ideas? And in class, we'll be getting you to, put them on paper. So hopefully we've had a look and learnt something from our discussion on Anthem for Doomed Youth, become a bit more familiar and comfortable with talking about poetic devices. And more importantly, that we get an appreciation of Owen's craft And here is this young man who, who's out there trying to do, I guess, the right thing in terms of supporting his, fellow, I guess, soldiers. And he's trying to express in terms of his poetry something that really is indescribable. But in doing so, he's coming up with a craft that is uniquely his own, and all of his poems that we are studying have been written in a short, intense period of time. And I think the greatest irony of all was that the fact that he was killed just so shortly, so close, to the whole end of World War One. And you can think of what could have happened in terms of his poetry if he survived and lived on. So this will be our first vodcast looking at Wilfred Owen's poetry, in particular Anthem for Doomed Youth. So again, just to remind ourselves that we should have our own copy of the poem in front of us as we're taking notes. You're more than welcome to pause, and you can stop the video at sort of any time and sort of catch up in terms with your writing. And just to remind ourselves, going on from our previous, I guess, episode, that we need to be aware, firstly, of developing our interpretation. So what does this poem mean? What is Owen trying to achieve with it? What is our reading of this text? We need to have an awareness of the values that are inherent within the poem as well. And more importantly, we need to be aware and identify how these language features and conventions and the structure of the poem helps to inform our reading.